If you've ever traveled through the Norwegian countryside, you might have encountered the various antlers hung up in the trees by the road. There are hundreds of these large moose antlers nailed to the massive pine trees that populate the inland wilderness, stretching on for miles. They're usually found hanging from the middle of the trunk, where they're in clear view of the road. Some of them are even brightly colored in sport fun patterns. Upon Googling what they are supposed to represent, you'll be met with Norwegian newspaper articles likely talking about how the antlers are a part of an art installation intended to keep drivers focused while on the road, preventing them from dozing off, and all that sort of nonsense. But that's not the real reason they're there. It's what the locals will tell you anyway. My story begins on the 25th of September this year. For my girlfriend's 19th birthday, I decided that I wanted to spend the weekend with her at the college she recently had started at. We hadn't seen each other in over a month, and the long-distance relationship life proved to be surprisingly more lonely than I had initially anticipated. Since most of my close friends had also left town for studying, I was left with a feeling of loneliness that I had never felt before. An empty feeling that accompanied me everywhere that I went. Even my boxing training or playing my usual video games seldom amused me anymore. I truly felt like a shell of my former self. And that's exactly why I was so excited about the thought of paying my girlfriend a visit. I yearned for social interaction, and a break from my mundane life was just what I needed. And the only problem was the distance between us. To get to her, I would have had to either buy an expensive two-way plane ticket or drive for 9 hours straight through mountainous terrain on bumpy, dilapidated roads, the latter being a thought I very much didn't relish. I opened up my bank account on my phone and I checked my balance. I sighed as I realized I had no other choice than to ask for my parents' permission to borrow the family car. After what felt like hours of persuasive arguing, they gave me a hesitant go-ahead, and my dad reluctantly tossed me the keys. Though initially skeptical, they probably thought getting some fresh air and interacting with people again would overall benefit me. Can't say that I disagreed. I went up the stairs to my room and excitedly called my girlfriend, informing her of the good news as I began hastily packing my bags. Before hanging up, I told her that I would be leaving tomorrow morning, and that she could expect to see me around 6 o'clock the following afternoon, should things go as planned. Saying it out loud filled me with dread. The longest distance I had ever driven before was to my grandparents' house across the fjord, 2 hours away from my home. This was a 9-hour trip, not counting rest stops and meal breaks along the way. Needless to say, my previous experiences on the road paled in comparison. I jumped in bed and groaned as my head hit the pillow. I had a long day ahead of me. The following morning, I awoke to my phone's alarm clock cheerfully chirping away. After a few minutes of booting up my consciousness, I quickly rose to my feet and got dressed. I ran downstairs, grabbed a few energy bars from the pantry, stuffed them in my pockets, and left the house in a hurry. I had no time to spare. The morning sun had already made the inside of my parents' car scorching hot. I felt as if I had entered a sauna as I sat down in the driver's seat and felt the burning leather of the steering wheel melt into my fingertips. I turned on the ignition and instantly flicked the air conditioning to its max setting. While the car began cooling off, I opened the GPS and looked for the fastest route possible to my destination. I live close to a small city in Norway called Trondheim. You've undoubtedly never heard of it. The city is located pretty far up north and lies close to the coast. Meanwhile, my girlfriend's new college is located just outside of Oslo, the country's capital. The only thing separating us was more than 500 kilometers of mountains, forests, and run-down highways. What's not to love? The GPS calculated a route that ran straight down the country as cleanly as it could. A long sigh escaped my body as I looked at the section of the display that informed me of the trip's estimated time. It read 9 hours and 32 minutes, longer than I had previously anticipated. I adjusted the mirrors, put the car in drive, and started heading down south. The first few hours of the trip flew by faster than expected. When driving, at least at the start of a long road trip, the concept of time seems to differ greatly from what we normally perceive. What feels like mere minutes in the car can quickly become hours in real time. This is especially true if you are driving through the unfathomable beauty of the Norwegian landscape. The sight of vast lush valleys and towering mountains, stretching as far as the eye can see, can quickly make you lose track of time. Oceans of green and orange were painted across the most serene autumn canvas that I had ever laid my eyes upon. It was breathtaking. I had never really traveled much outside Trondheim before, and the beautiful scenery proved to be almost overwhelming. I drove past several small villages and rural communities, each sprawling with life and personality. If you've never been to Norway, or any other geographically similar country, it's honestly hard to fully describe the beauty and serenity of driving through the beautiful subalpine landscape. My road trip was nearing the 3-hour mark when I decided that I needed a small break to stretch my legs, munch on some energy bars, and get some fresh air. I pulled over at a small highway rest stop by the side of the road. There were a few other cars parked here, along with a small cafe and a large electronic billboard. I exited my car and took a deep breath of the clean mountain air. It felt refreshing. I turned around to take in my surroundings when I noticed a blinking yellow light emitting from the billboard. It displayed a large yellow triangle with an exclamation point in the middle, accompanied by a piece of soul-crushing information. Highway E6 was currently undergoing maintenance a couple of kilometers further up the road. The billboard pointed out that many motorists who had intended on traveling on it would have to divert their path and take County Road 255 instead. I cursed quietly under my breath. This meant that I would now have to take a massive detour on some sketchy isolated road out in the middle of nowhere. Great, I thought. Just what I needed. This would probably extend my trip by at least an hour and a half. I got back in my car and typed in the newly acquired piece of information into my GPS. According to it, I would soon be entering a heavily wooded and secluded stretch of road. The kind of road you don't want to be on should your car begin to break down or act funny. I started my car and left the rest stop behind, continuing along Highway E6 until I encountered the large roadblock the billboard had warned me about. Next to it stood a large orange sign with an arrow on it. My eyes followed the arrow and saw that it pointed toward an exit ramp to my right. I turned my steering wheel and drove onto County Road 255. The change was immediately noticeable. This new road made the highway seem like a piece of art. If the E6 was a quiet lake on a beautiful summer's day, County Road 255 was a stormy ocean just waiting to swallow any unfortunate sailor who dared brave its massive waves. The road was full of potholes and cracked, overgrown asphalt. It looked like nobody had traveled down this path for years. Maybe nobody had. After all, I could think of a few reasons as to why anyone would ever come out here. And despite the occasional jolts of my car as I hit a pothole, I kept on driving. Massive pine trees now surrounded me on both sides, and the road had become significantly more narrow than it used to be. 30 minutes had passed since I had entered this road, and I sat in my car listening to some old 80s pop song over the radio while chewing on a protein bar. The loud hum of 4 wheels traversing on decade-old asphalt almost began to feel soothing. That's when I first saw them. A pair of large brown antlers were nailed to a tree a couple of meters in front of me. I almost didn't register them as I zoomed past. I would have probably chalked it up to my imagination if it weren't for a second pair of antlers on a different tree, just a short distance ahead. I slowed my car to get a better look at them this time. This set of antlers sported a peculiar pattern of black stripes that ran diagonally down the pair. Across the road, my eyes laid upon yet another set of antlers. These ones were colored in a bright blue polka dot pattern. I noticed another pair. These ones were bright red in color. My car came to a full stop as I investigated these strange road markings. More and more of them seemed to come into view, each dyeing their own unique color and pattern. The forest was full of them. How strange, I thought. Must be a part of some local art installation or something. I quietly mumbled under my breath. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking around at the various pairs of antlers that surrounded me. It was honestly kind of admirable that they managed to even bother with public art in a place like this. I mean, who would be around to appreciate it? I snapped out of my trance and resumed driving, thinking there was no use in delaying my arrival in Oslo any further. As I continued down the seemingly endless road, more and more antlers seemed to emerge from the tree line. As more of them came into view, I began questioning their authenticity. Surely, there couldn't have been this many moose in the whole county. Did they import thousands of antlers just to hang them up in a place where virtually nobody would ever come to see them? The more that I thought about it, the more something seemed a bit off. I kept on driving. As I made my way further down the road, I noticed less and less of the colored antlers. Most of the antlers passing me were now just the normal tan or brown that antlers usually came in. Occasionally, some blue or green ones would appear, but the majority of them were now just their natural color. I kept on driving. To my utter disbelief, I saw a building rising on the horizon. A bright red Circle K gas station stood in the stark contrast to the dense murky forest surrounding it. Instinctually, I checked the gas gauge in the car and noticed that I had little less than 2/4 left of fuel. Though I expected more, this still wasn't a small quantity of gas, and it would take me pretty far. I hesitated for a moment. It couldn't hurt to refill now that the opportunity had arisen. I mean, who knows how long it'll be until the next time I get the chance. I certainly wouldn't want to be left stranded out here, in the middle of nowhere, delaying my trip even further. The station crept closer and closer until I decided to pull over. Better safe than sorry, was the recurring thought in the back of my mind. I pulled up to one of the gas pumps and I stepped out of the car. The atmosphere of the forest hit me like a brick wall. There wasn't a single sound to be heard. No birds, no rustling of trees, and no wind. It was eerily quiet. This filled me with a sense of unease that I didn't know I was capable of feeling. It was like somewhere deep in my mind, some primal instinct kept warning me of something. I nearly got back in my car to keep driving, but reasoned that there was nothing to be afraid of. I told myself that I was being silly. I shook the feeling as best as I could as I grabbed the gas pump and started filling up the car. After roughly 5 seconds of pumping, a loud metallic buzzing sound emitted from the pump and I could feel it go slightly limp. It had stopped working. I tried tinkering with it and repeatedly pressed down on the release, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed the pump had simply run out of gas. Strange. I had never encountered this problem before. I didn't even know this could happen to begin with. I placed the pump back on its holster and made my way toward the inside of the gas station to report the problem. Just as I was about to enter, my eyes caught something a short distance to my right. It was a massive pine tree, probably predating the Vikings by the look of it. It looked ancient. The pine had a slightly more gray and worn out bark than that of the other trees, and it towered above anything I had seen in this forest thus far. But that's not what made me stop dead in my tracks. After all, I had seen large trees before. No, what sent chills down my spine was what stared back at me. Up there, situated maybe 3 meters off the ground, sat a large pair of brown antlers. These were different from the rest. On both sides, close to the middle, were 2 painted-on eyes. They were outlined by a dark crimson coloration that seemed to have seeped further down the antlers. The amount of detail in the eyes had me questioning whether or not they were real for a second. I stood and watched as they ominously stared back at me. It felt as if they were going to blink at any moment. I was finally able to divert my gaze, and I headed inside at the gas station. The inside of the station was a whole other story. I don't know how I didn't notice it from the outside. The store was completely empty. There wasn't as much as a single bag of beef jerky lining the shelves. They had been picked clean by the looks of it. Most of the fluorescent lights that illuminated the store were still on, indicating that the place still had electricity somehow. The floors were a bit dirty, and a nasty mold had started growing on the ceiling by the corner closest to the door. But other than that, the store was in pristine condition. I walked over to the counter hoping to find some answers that would shed light on this peculiar situation. But I found nothing. No signs of life. No convenient newspaper clippings that would transcribe the history of the gas station in exquisite detail. I was left dumbfounded. What had happened here? I fished my phone out of my pocket, only to quickly realize that any attempts at using it were futile. I had no service, cliché I know. I raised my phone high into the air as if it would suddenly gain full 5G coverage. Starting to feel creeped out, I quickly turned around and headed for the exit. Immediately after I left the station, the immense feeling of dread returned. This time it seemed stronger. It was still eerily quiet out, and I felt as if I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I now had goosebumps all over my body. Then, out of nowhere, something broke the silence. A loud snapping of twigs could be heard coming from the forest behind me. To be honest, the sheer magnitude of the snap made it sound more like a tree got snapped in half rather than a couple of twigs. Without looking back, I booked it to my car and drove out of there as fast as I could, making sure to roll up any windows and to lock all the doors. I continued down the road, hoping that I would get back to civilization relatively soon. I must have been driving for what felt like an hour, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. How long was this road supposed to be again? I should be nearing civilization any time now, but I only saw signs that would indicate otherwise. The forest seemed to grow thicker and the trees taller. I pushed my foot down on the accelerator. I didn't care if I was speeding at this point. Not like there would be anyone around to enforce traffic laws anyway. I just wanted to get out of this dang forest at all costs. A heavy overcast now loomed above, which didn't exactly help the situation. The thick clouds prevented sunlight from shining down, and the woods felt unusually dark for it only being 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As I drove, I saw more antlers stuck to the trees lining the road. Each one looked more ominous than the last. I could have sworn a few of them even had a dark and thick, viscous liquid dripping from them. I kept driving, pressing my foot harder on the accelerator. I looked down at my phone to see if I had gotten a signal. Still nothing. I swear that I only took my eyes off the road for a second, but that's all it would take for me to nearly hit whatever now laid in the middle of the road. My car came to a screeching halt as I stomped my foot down on the brakes as hard as I could, nearly swerving off course in the process. The car's headlights illuminated a large furry mass that laid strewn across the road, blocking it in its entirety. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. Dozens of dead, decaying animals formed a roadblock that looked like it came straight out of below. I couldn't tell you how many animals there were. Maybe 10, 15, 30. The mass consisted mostly of deer and moose carcasses, but I'm pretty sure that I saw a few sheep, a cow, and maybe even a horse in there as well. I did what a normal person would have done in my situation. I began freaking out. As if everything that had happened earlier wasn't creepy enough, I now had to deal with the sight of several of those animals in the road. And even worse, there was nothing I could do. The road was completely blocked. Attempting to drive past it on either side would likely result in my car getting stuck in some ditch, worsening the situation by tenfold. Once I had collected most of my nerves, I sat pondering upon what my next course of action would be. Obviously, there was no way that I wanted to step out of my car. I had seen enough horror movies to know what happens to people in these kinds of situations. I thought about driving back the way that I came from, yet again passing the gas station and continuing until I reached the highway I had initially driven on. Somehow, finding an alternative route to Oslo that didn't involve me getting killed by some depraved serial killer or forest monster. That thought quickly faded as I realized I wouldn't have enough fuel for the trip. I looked at the gas gauge and saw that I only had less than a quarter left of juice. This was bad. I could have sworn that I had more. I wouldn't be able to make the trip back, and getting stuck out there in the dark seemed like a worst-case scenario. Even if I got past this roadblock, I still wasn't sure if I would have enough gas to reach civilization beyond it. Eventually, I realized that I had to take action. In here, I was a sitting duck to whoever or whatever was out there, if there was even something out there. To ease up the situation, I reasoned that this all might just be a big creepy coincidence. Apart from what sounded like a large tree snapping in half back at the gas station, I really hadn't seen any indication of life. Sinister in nature or not, I hadn't even heard the song of birds. Perhaps the forest really was abandoned. Yeah, that was probably it. I'm just being overly paranoid. The result of listening to too many scary campfire stories as a kid. I scanned the pile of animals and noticed that I might actually be able to move a few of them out of the way, just barely enough to squeeze my car through. The right side of the blockade seemed to be comprised of smaller animals, and I decided that if I could just move a few of them out of the way, it would be enough for me to hightail it out of there. I reluctantly opened my car door and stepped outside, immediately regretting my decision. The smell. Oh God, the smell. I don't know what I expected, but the smell of dozens of rotting animals didn't exactly go easy on the nose. The stench of decay made every fiber of my being want to puke. I tried suppressing my violent bowel movements as best as I could. I took a couple of deep breaths and made my way toward the pile. Halfway to the pile, I jumped as I heard the recognizable sound of wood snapping in the distance, the same sound that I had heard back at the station. I kept walking. Unsurprisingly, the closer I got to the pile, the worse the smell got. Despite this, I pushed through as I grabbed the hind legs of the deer and began dragging it out of the way. Another large snap sounded, this time way closer. I paid no attention to it and strenuously tugged at the decaying deer carcass. These things were much heavier than they looked. I managed to drag it off the road just as another loud sound could be heard, this time even closer. I recognized the distinct sound of a tree cracking, and I saw a tall pine tree fall out of the tree line and land on the road that I came from, a small distance behind my car. Whatever was responsible was closing in. My heart sank at the thought. I was suddenly filled with a sense of urgency as I grabbed another set of animal legs and desperately began tugging. A new set of twigs snapped, this time alarmingly close. I looked back to the dense woodland next to my car and saw the dark, shadowy silhouette of something big moving through the underbrush. I could feel the panic start to set in. Through sheer adrenaline-infused strength, I launched the deer off the road. Just as I was about to turn around and head back to the car, I heard the sound of heavy hoofed footsteps behind me. I could feel the ground shake a little with each step. By the clacking of the sound, I could tell that whatever they belonged to now had made its way onto the asphalt. I stood frozen in fear. A large exhale slithered out of the thing behind me. The sound reminded me of a snorting horse, only more guttural and distorted. The heat of the thing's breath had reached the back of my neck, and I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. My heart began beating so fast that I felt as if it would burst out of my chest cavity at any moment. I finally mustered up the courage to turn around, and my eyes were laid upon the most gruesome monstrosity I had ever seen. Have you ever had a nightmare or an experience so terrifying that you weren't even able to scream? Have you ever encountered an immense feeling of horror so excruciatingly dreadful that it overwhelmed your entire body? And that's exactly how I felt as I turned around to look at the creature that now stood between me and my ticket out of here. Partially illuminated by the headlights of the car, I could only describe the beast's shape as vaguely moose-like in appearance, putting heavy emphasis on the word vaguely. It was large, very large, at least double the height of my car. Along with 4 hooved limbs, 2 large, hairy appendages protruded from each side of the creature's torso, reaching down to the ground. They almost resembled the legs of a spider. Along its back were large ridges of spine that had seemed to protuberate through the monster's thick hide. But that wasn't even the worst part about this abomination's appearance. It was the creature's head that really hammered down the feeling of being in the presence of an eldritch monstrosity. A large set of antlers dominated its upper skull, except they weren't really antlers. They looked more like a set of massive, bony human hands, altered to mimic the antlers of a moose. Some of the gaunt fingers were even freakishly elongated to further sell the look. The creature had no eyes, no real ones anyway. Instead, 2 large oval markings seemed to be painted onto its antlers. It reminded me of those fake eyes cobras and certain instincts have that are used to intimidate would-be predators. Lastly, the creature's lower jaw consisted of 2 long, deer-like mandibles that were equipped with several rows of long, spindly, serrated teeth. And before I had the chance to react, the bestial figure screeched and began rapidly crawling towards me. When I say crawling, I mean it. Each of its 6 limbs bent down at awkward angles and began unnaturally scurrying my way. It was fast. I could hear the snapping of bones coming from the creature as it moved. Each appendage seemed to have a will of its own, dragging the rest of the monster with it. It looked unnaturally contorted. In an act of pure desperation, I ducked into the pile of animals behind me and buried myself deep in the decomposing flesh, hoping that the creature would eventually lose track of me and give up. In retrospect, it probably wasn't the brightest idea, but I figured I stood no chance in outrunning it, especially not in the dense woodland. Whatever this thing was, it would be perfectly adapted for pursuit through dense underbrush, something I was not. My sanctuary didn't last for long as I saw one of its spider-like appendages strike down in the flash right next to me. I could hear guttural vocalizations escape its mouth as it began frantically searching for me. It sounded horrible. I was on the verge of tears by this point. There was no way I was going to get out of this situation alive. I felt truly doomed. Another appendage struck down beside me. It was going to find me eventually, and the situation seemed hopeless. I watched in horror as the deer carcass I had been hiding under got effortlessly tossed aside by the creature. I could see it in even more detail now. Its dark, thick hide looked cracked and worn down, a texture very reminiscent of tree bark. It had noticed me. The beast tilted its head downwards, and I could feel the artificial eyes of the antlers staring into my soul. An ear-piercing screech left its body as it raised one of its appendages and wrapped it around my foot. I noticed that the end of the spider-like leg came attached with a pair of sharp opposable claws. The claws dug into my leg, and I let out a scream of excruciating pain. This was how I was going to die. The creature opened its mouth and I was presented with rows upon rows of sharp yellow teeth. In a last desperate attempt at survival, I kicked the creature's 2 mandibles as hard as I could with my other leg. It visibly recoiled in pain. I kicked it again, even harder this time. I could feel it loosen its grip on my foot, and I rolled over and got back on my feet. Limping towards the car, I swung open the driver's seat door and got in just in time for the creature to slam its entire body weight against the vehicle. It wasn't giving up without a fight. I slammed down on the accelerator with my foot and sped through the opening in the roadblock that I had previously cleared. I could feel the ground shake behind me as I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the massive beast in hot pursuit. I was going well over 100 kilometers an hour by now, but my assailant only seemed to come closer and closer. This should have been impossible. How was it moving so fast? I sped up even more. I could hear the roar of the engine as it probably produced the fastest moving car in Europe at that moment. I prayed to every god imaginable as I looked to my left and saw that the galloping creature had caught up to the car and was now running beside it. It turned towards me and I could have sworn I saw a sickly and contorted smile begin to form around its mouth. I started cursing, contemplating just crashing the car into a tree so that my death would at least be swift and relatively painless. I closed my eyes and braced for the inevitable attack. Seconds, maybe even minutes had gone by before I realized. It never came. I was completely fine still driving along the road. I looked back at the rearview mirror and saw that the creature had just stopped in the middle of its tracks. It was just standing there as if it suddenly decided I wasn't worth the effort. I also noticed the strange antlers on the trees on both sides of the road. These antlers were similar to the other ones, except they seemed larger and were inscribed with weird symbols and markings. Due to the distance between us, I couldn't make out what the antlers said or depicted. The 2 parallel antlers almost reminded me of some sort of gate, as if it marked the border between the creature's territory and our world. Past the antlers towards my direction, the surrounding trees seemed completely normal. I was no longer surrounded by antlers, and the forest even seemed more inviting. The grotesque monster let out a bellowing roar, and I watched as it turned around and disappeared into the gloomy woodland. After a short while of driving, I was met with a big blue sign that pointed me toward Highway E6. I was relieved beyond comprehension. Eventually, the surrounding forest seemed to ease up, and after a few minutes of following the sign, I was reunited with the scenic valleys and subalpine landscapes that I had previously ventured on. I steered back onto Highway E6 and rode it until I arrived at a small but busy gas station in a small, rural community. As I parked my car, I broke down in tears and tried to make sense of what had just happened. I guess my adrenaline must have worn off because the last thing I remembered before waking up was slamming my head down to the steering wheel and passing out. I awoke a couple of hours later to tapping on my window. 2 police officers were called in when customers at the gas station had noticed a lifeless man covered in blood sitting alone in his car. They must have thought that I was dead or something. Not that I blame them, I really looked like a zombie. My clothes were all torn and red from the ordeal in the dead animal pile. I got out of my vehicle and tried explaining my situation. They brought me back to the local police station for a psychic and medical evaluation. When I gave them a statement, I described everything that had happened to me in perfect detail and tried to sound as sane as possible while doing it. At first, I couldn't tell if they believed me. I mean, who would? It was only after I gave them the location of where I had encountered the creature that they began tensing up. A heavy silence fell upon the interrogation room, and the 2 officers nervously exchanged looks. It was as if they knew something I didn't. I asked them about County Road 255 and the abandoned gas station, but they were quick to shut down any questions that I had. The official police report states that I'd been in a state of shock from a local bear attack when the two officers had found me. That's how they explain what had caused the wound to my leg and why I had massive scratch marks all over my car. It was ridiculous. Everyone and their mother knows there hasn't been a reported bear sighting in the area for over 100 years. When they eventually released me, I called up my girlfriend to let her know that I wasn't going to be arriving until tomorrow afternoon. I checked into a nearby motel and asked the receptionist if he knew anything about County Road 255 or the strange antlers that line the road. The receptionist was an old man in his early 60s who looked like the sort of guy who would know a thing or two about the town's history. He fell silent. I asked again, and I could see that my questions made him visibly uncomfortable. After a while of debating whether or not he should open his mouth, he reluctantly told me that people, especially outsiders, weren't supposed to go there. When I asked why, he quietly mumbled to me under his breath, as if not to be heard by others, the people who venture into these surrounding woods never come back out. Apparently, this had been going on for decades, but had somehow never been picked up by any local or national news outlets. When I asked him why they didn't just close down the road, he told me that the town tried doing it back in the late 80s, but that it had just led to the disappearance happening closer and closer to town. As a result, they kept the road open as if to please whatever malevolent entity that called the forest its home. I tried further prying on the subject, but he refused to elaborate. After a while, I thanked him and I went up to my room. I don't know what to make of all of this. People in this town seem to know something about that forest that they aren't telling me. The police don't even want to go out there to investigate whether or not my claims hold any truth. There is something off about this entire thing. For the past few hours, I've been sitting in my motel room, transcribing my experience as best as I could while the memory is still fresh in my mind. Let my story serve as a cautionary tale. If you ever plan on traveling through the Norwegian countryside and happen to see antlers hanging from the trees by the road, beware, something else might be lurking nearby.